Hey guys, Matthew, and welcome to another episode of Crafting Optimized. In today's video, we're going to be going over fire damage over time amulets. Now, here's a list of a few different builds that could best utilize this amulet. So things that are really popular right now would be like Explosive Arrow, of course, Righteous Fire, super popular, Summon Raging Spirits. Those are the type of builds that can best utilize this amulet. Here's the list of the ones that I basically wrote down. So you can see this. Now let's talk about the actual craft. As always, I'm going to bring you guys multiple different budget options. So for super cheap, and then of course we're going to look at things which are going to be a little bit more pricey later on in the video. So the thing about fire damage, which is essentially the same thing when it came to cold damage, and the reason why the crafting is going to be done the way that we're going to do it is because we have no access to reforging fire because of the inability to do reforge keeping prefixes if we get stuck along the way. So we can't do reforge fires the same way that we can do reforge chaos or physical, which is going to basically change our way of crafting this amulet. All right, so what we're going to do is for the super budget option, we're going to start off by basically just grabbing an amulet, which is going to be fractured +1 fire. Now, these are more expensive than the previous option of either physical, cold, or whatnot. And the reason for that is because, well, fire is a lot more popular, right? Like I was saying, there's EA, there's Righteous Fire, which is super popular. So you're probably going to have to shell out about 2 divines for the base by itself. So that is going to be the main cost of the actual craft for the budget version of it. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to start off by just grabbing an Onyx Amulet, and we're going to start off with our Fractured +1 Fire, right? Because this is our baseline cost and in actual base. Now you could set up a live search to try to get one of the better bases for probably about 2 divines instead of one of the crappy bases. You can see here 25 minutes ago an A gate was listed for 2 divines at item level 83, which is perfectly fine. So you could go for something like this. Now once we have our actual base, what we're going to be looking for is to alteration spam. And we are going to alteration spam for damage over time multiplier. You can see that the highest tier is item level 82. So you probably want 76 or above whenever buying these amulets to try to increase your odds, to give you the ability to even roll T2 or T1. But I wouldn't necessarily worry too much about T1 because as you can see, it's quite rare. It's like 400 alterations, which is not, well, it's not that much currency, but it's quite annoying. Actually, it's way more than that now that I think about it, I believe, because it's in reality. Oh, yeah. So, okay. So 405 alterations. And then, of course, if you're augmenting as well to get that. While T2 is only like 200. So personally, I would go for T2. It's not even 30 chaos worth of alterations to get T2. And it's a multiplier on your build, which is really strong. All right. So that's exactly what we're going to do here on our actual craft. We're basically just simply going to alteration spam. Now, you'll see that most of the time when you alteration spam, or about like half of the time, it's actually not going to give you anything. Essentially, this means that it rolled a prefix. So if it doesn't give you anything, you'll need to use an augment to basically give you that suffix that you're not going to get. So you'll essentially need, it does say for like 200 alterations, but in reality, it's like 200 alterations and also probably 200 or even more augments. But augments are not really worth anything. Typically, people have like a lot of those laying around and they're being sold for pretty cheap. Now, once we eventually reach that point where we get our damage over time multiplier, and I'll just throw on T2 here with the +1. Now, unfortunately, we cannot imprint this because it's fractured, so it wouldn't let us imprint it back. So we're just going to have to hit it with a Regal. Now, what we want is to Regal on fire damage amulet specifically because we're going to want to craft on +1 frenzy charge and either life or ES. We're going to want to Regal a prefix. So anything that's not a prefix, we're going to beast craft. So in this case, we Regaled a regen. And it's a really low tier. Now, of course, if we Regal something which is good and something that we want, we could totally keep that, and instead we're going to be crafting 2 prefixes. But for the most part, to make it consistent, what we're going to do is if we Regal a suffix, we're going to use a Ferric Wolf Alpha. This is going to remove a suffix and add a prefix, so it's going to be a 50% chance of removing the regen versus the dot. And as long as it removes the dot, whatever we get on the prefix doesn't really matter, unless it's like super low tier life, in which case you're probably going to want to try to annul. Or let's just say, for example, if you're playing a low life Righteous Fire build here, or maybe you're playing like a low life or like a CI Scorching Ray, Wave of Conviction, Ignite thing, I don't know, whatever it is, and you really want to get better ES, then you'd have to go for an annul. However, in most cases, what's going to happen is that you're going to beastcraft, and it's just going to give you some random prefix which you don't care about, like evasion, damage to attacks, physical damage, whatever. It doesn't really matter, because at this point, we're going to have 2 prefixes, and then our damage over time suffix. Now, of course, if you beastcraft it off, or if you annul it off, what you're going to need to do is to simply go back to scouring your item, and then spamming alterations once more. So once we get our 2 prefixes and our dot multi, we're essentially going to be pretty much done with our craft. We're just going to go ahead and multi-mod it, and that's going to be the end of it. So this is going to be another suffix, and then for the prefixes, we're essentially going to decide whether we want life on our amulet. So let's say we're playing a life-based righteous fire character, or let's say we're playing some sort of like trickster, low life, CI, whatever the hell, and we want energy shield, and we're going to go with energy shield. And for the most part, on pretty much every single one of these builds which utilize fire damage over time multiplier, what's going to be really, really good as our last suffix is going to be +1 to minimum frenzy charges. So that's what we're going to go ahead and craft. It's typically the one that you'll want to craft both for profit and just overall, just a very solid craft for self-use. Now, of course, if you need something specific for your own build, such as resistance, attributes, or anything else, maybe you want endurance charges instead, you can go ahead and feel free to throw that on instead. But I think that frenzy charge is the better way to go. That's pretty much it for our super budget option, right? We're buying the base, which is the majority of the cost, and then there's going to be the multi-modding, but otherwise it's a very, very cheap craft and super like deterministic, if you will, because there's not a whole lot of things that can go wrong on this version of the craft. All right, now let's go ahead and look at something which could be a little bit more endgame, and that's essentially going to be starting with a fractured damage over time multiplier. Now, you can get T1 for basically 1 divine. However, if you want some of the better bases, they're going to be a little bit more than that. Probably more like 1.5 to 2 divines. But again, if you're willing to be patient, set up a live search, you could probably get a pretty decent base for even less than that. But yeah, that's kind of where we're going to be starting the craft. And the reason for that is because, again, we don't have the opportunity, or the ability, I should say, to get fire damage over time multiplier later on through fire reforges, because there's too many fire tagged suffixes, and fire more likely on the reforge more likelies are gone, right? So that's kind of why we're going to go with that. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab our damage over time multiplier suffix. We're going to go ahead and fracture that. Now, to be fair, this is also actually stronger than the T1 fire damage over time multiplier from, say, the Hunter influence, so that's pretty good. And then what we're going to do is we are going to once again alteration spam, but it's going to be the opposite. Instead of alteration spamming for the dot multi and starting with the +1 fire, we're going to start with the dot multi, and we're going to alteration for +1 all. Now, this can get pretty expensive. As you can see, it's an average close to 2,000 alterations. So not only is it expensive, it's also really annoying. Unfortunately, there's simply no way around it. If we want a +2 amulet with dot multi suffix and to do it deterministically, this is going to be the way to go. Overall, though, for what you're going to be getting, this cost here is actually not that bad at all. All right, so we're going to go ahead and simply alteration spam until we end up, it's going to be the same thing, right? Sometimes it won't give you a prefix, so you'll have to use an augment. And then you'll do this over and over and over until eventually you are going to go ahead and get the prefix which is desired, which in our case is +1 to all skills. Now, once you get to this point, again, we can't imprint because we have fracture and mod, so the only thing we can do is regal. So now, what's going to be important now is what you regal. If you regal a suffix, like in this case, for example, we would have to annul it because we need to get rid of whatever we regal. However, because it's a suffix and because this is pretty expensive to get, what I would recommend doing is crafting on the modifier prefixes cannot be changed and then scouring it, right? This is going to make it so it's going to remain a rare item. This is going to make it so it's going to keep you your +1, and it's also going to keep your dot multi because it's fractured, right? And this is going to make it so you're basically ready to keep going with the craft. However, in the situation where you actually regal a prefix, so like this, for example, you are doomed. The only thing you can do is 50-50 annul, and there is nothing else you can do. So if you get rid of your +1 spells, like I just did twice in a row, you essentially need to go back to alteration spamming, which is really a letdown. Now, on the bright side, if you look at the actual weighting, you can see that there is 120,000 weighting on amulets for suffixes versus 92,000 for prefixes. So you're more likely to actually regal a suffix, and if you do regal a prefix, Well, it's a 50-50. So overall, it's not the end of the world. But once we get to this point, what we're going to do now is essentially we're going to craft on the suffix can have up to 3 crafted mod, and then we're also going to need prefixes cannot be changed to lock in this modifier. Now, normally we would also need cannot roll attack modifier so that when we augment, we are guaranteed +1 to fire, right? Because otherwise, there's always the ability to instead get, say, fire damage to attacks. Now, the cool little trick is that since we have 3 suffixes, because this is a suffix, and we have multi-mod, we can simply go ahead and craft on the fire damage to attacks instead on our amulet. And when we go ahead and aug, because it can't aug as something that's already on there because it's blocked from the mod pool, it is going to guarantee us +1 fire. So if I go ahead and craft fire damage to attacks, now I have my +1, my dot multi-fractured, multi-mod prefixes not be changed, and fire damage to attacks. If I go to harvest and I augment fire, it's guaranteed to give me +1 fire. It cannot give me anything else. The only outcome is this. And, of course, because our +1 spells is safe due to the fact that we have our prefixes cannot be changed, that means that essentially we're good to go. Now, at this point, you're basically going to have 2 choices. Now, what I would recommend is to essentially remove crafted mods to get to the point where you have your 2 prefixes in your dot multi, and then to finish off with an actual multi-mod on the amulet is what I would go for. So again, I would go ahead and craft multi-mod, and then for my prefixes, I would decide whether I want life if I'm life-based or ES if I'm ES-based. So let's just say I'm ES at this point. And then I would finish off with this minimum frenzy charges that I was talking about earlier, because I think it's a really, really solid option. So I would end up with a +2 amulet, dot multi, which is actually better than the T1 from the hunter, and then either ES or life. Now, of course, the ES and the life are both not quite as good as, say, if you were to get T1, but the cost is significantly reduced. And then +1 frenzy as my final suffix for more damage. Or, of course, if we're lacking anything specifically, we could also go for that. For example, maybe you're playing some sort of fire-based, fire damage over time based trap skills or mind seal. You could go ahead with trap throwing speed or mind throwing speed instead of this frenzy charge, a minimum frenzy charge. You could also go for effective non-damaging element if you're doing some sort of shenanigans with like chill. Like for example, I'm not exactly sure actually what would use that, but whatever. It's really up to you, right? Because obviously ignite is a damaging element, so maybe I take that back. But yeah, there's whatever the choice is in terms of the final suffix, but this is my recommendation. Now, however, you can go further if you really wanted to. And the way that you would do this is instead, once you get to this point where you have the +2 and the dot multi, what you can do is to, and this is going to become very expensive very quickly, you can craft the suffix, prefixes cannot be changed, and then you can actually go for an ashling, right? Now, this is going to, because your prefixes are locked, the only thing that it can hit is the prefixes cannot be changed, no matter how many times I do this. The downside is that if I hit a veiled suffix, there's nothing for me to really do about this, because the problem with hitting a veiled suffix at this point in the craft is that essentially I've got nowhere to go after that. So even if I unveil something and it's actually good, like, I don't know, let's say +1 minimum frenzy endurance charges and endurance charge on kill, where do I go from now, right? Because I can't multi-mod because I already have, only one suffix and one prefix opened, and, I can't really force anything else. So what you would actually have to do if you actually hit a veiled suffix is to craft prefixes cannot be changed and to scour it, and then to craft prefixes cannot be changed again, and then to ashling again until you ashling a prefix. Now, once you actually have prefix, because you have 2 prefixes already, you can't do any sort of blocking shenanigans, so you just have to unveil and hope for the best. Of course, whatever you get is whatever you get. So in this case, I got life and regen, which is perfect. That's obviously what you want to get, but it's probably something like a 50% chance, if not lower. I don't know exactly of actually getting the life, and there's no ES unveil, so this only works if you're a life-based build in the first place, which is why I really, really don't like this method of going about it. But yeah, anyways, it is still available to you if you wanted to go for it. All right, so let's just say that we get the life. Now we've got our 2 prefixes. So we have 3, and then we have our actual suffix, which is fractured, so we can't do anything with that. So at this point, because we essentially have our 3 prefixes, what we could do is to craft on the prefix suffixes cannot be changed, and then go for some reforging in order to get something that we may want. Now, here's the downside. Because we already have the dot multi, And because there's really not many other suffixes that we actually care for, we're essentially left with like cast speed, which has very limited use. Now, it would be good on something like, for example, Flameblast, if you're playing like Ignite Flameblast, or say, for example, if you're playing Wave Conviction, cast speed is quite good. So we could go for Reforged Caster, as there is no other caster modifiers whatsoever, so it would be guaranteed to give us some cast speed on it. The other possibility is to go for Chaos Resistance, because again, Chaos Resistance does not have any other Chaos tags, so you would be guaranteed Chaos Resistance. Now, here's kind of where the problem happens. If you were to actually go ahead and reforge, say, the caster, there's a 10% chance that it fills in your suffixes. So if it does fill in your suffixes, there's nothing you can do. You can't even craft the final suffix. You're essentially left with just a dead mod of whatever you happen to get upon reforging. So let's see if I can get it to proc here, because it's only 10%, which is not that big of a deal. All right, so here, well, that's actually pretty good. You got T1 cast speed and T2 chaos res. Maybe not the best possible example to showcase this. So let's see if we can do worse than that, because that was actually quite good. Okay, there we go. See, we got cast speed and then we got accuracy. So this accuracy mod would literally be a dead mod, which makes it so we cannot actually craft anything that we want. And the cast speed, in this case, which we got T3 of, is basically set in stone. So we can't even increase it, which is why I'm really not a big fan of crafting with this method, and why I recommend going with a multi-mod, because on average, you're going to get an extremely similar amulet, but with significantly less cost and significantly less risk. However, if you wanted to go ham, you could craft on this prefixes cannot be changed and go for it. So let's say, for example, here we were to reforge the caster modifier. So we got T4, we're not happy with that. Prefixes cannot be changed, reforged caster, T4 again, not happy with that. Every time I say again, it's 2 divines. Not happy with T4, go again, T3, not happy with that. All right, T2. Okay, let's just say, you know what, T2 is good enough. We can also increase this by using caster or speed catalyst to make it so that it's actually a little bit better. Because of course these two are non-changeable values, and the life does get affected by life catalyst if you wanted to go with that instead. But then we would essentially be able to craft on our final suffix. Now, of course, if your build does not utilize cast speed and you're a fire damage over time build, such as Explosive Arrow, completely useless, or Righteous Fire, which are the two current most popular fire damage over time skills anyways, then this cast speed would be useless. However, doesn't mean that there's nothing else you can do, because you could also just go for Reforged Chaos for some Chaos Resistance, and that is actually quite good for both of those builds. And then we'll essentially finish it off with whatever craft that we want. So both those builds could actually benefit from Frenzy Charges, so we could go with that. So let's go ahead and simply craft the minimum Frenzy Charges, and that would be the state of our craft if you were going for like mirror tier. Now, don't get me wrong, nobody would ever mirror this, because there's no way that this would ever cost anywhere near the cost of actual mirror, right? The base is just a couple divines. The alteration spamming process is a handful of divines, and, you know, it's relatively deterministic. Then the augmenting the +1 fire is completely deterministic, so it's basically just an augment with a multi-mod, and then essentially it's a handful of divines, probably 10 to 20 divines, somewhere around there, to be able to unveil for a prefix and get life, and then a few reforges. So this would never cost anywhere near a mirror, therefore it would never be anywhere near mirror tier, but it's still an extremely, extremely solid amulet. And realistically, that's pretty much as good as it's going to get, unless you're basically willing to invest literally thousands of exalts into exalt slamming to get both damage over time multiplier and fire damage over time multiplier from the hunter influence. But we're not going to go there. This series, I'm trying to keep it to where it's either budget or endgame viable, but not necessarily like completely mirror tier, because I know that that's not going to actually affect like any more than just a handful of players. So that's pretty much it for my fire damage over time amulet. Hopefully you guys learned a little bit from this video. Before I go, as always, I do want to say a massive thank you to my Patreon squads, to the 3 Alexes, Skady, Bearded Abe, Brandon, Gustavo, Tim, Domosame, Desu, Miss, Gerald, Loopold, Mercury, as well as Nake, Patrick, Riskold, Bert, Rocky, Solmonk, Exile, The Great Master, Thomas Mess, Maestro, Nailed, Ven, Bitizen, Nectarion, Noik, Zeftion, and Larsis, anyone else who has supported me in the past, and anyone else who wishes to remain anonymous. So good luck crafting out there, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.